Welcome to Wandering Jews, a J-Square Adventures. Travel far enough and you meet yourself.
We're your hosts. I'm Scott.
And I'm Sorrel.
I think a lot of times in the public imagination, we have this prejudice against museums, and we kind of picture them maybe a little bit like libraries. You know, it's dusty, it's dark, it's a bit inaccessible, it's stuff that you really shouldn't be touching. And when you get to the building on the campus of Tel Aviv University, that's Anu, us or we, the Museum of the Jewish People, what used to be called in ancient times, so to speak, the Diaspora Museum. It's very, very different. I think there's a sense of air, of light, of welcome, of a story which is exciting, which is both fun and also funny, which is, I think, unusual in terms of the way we sometimes think about Jewish history and teaching Jewish history and the Jewish experience. And the museum is a product of many, many years of evolution. And so in the 1970s, it was opened and pioneered, designed by figures like Nachum Goldman, like Abba Kovner, people who were leading lights of the Jewish world in the years after the Holocaust and the period of rebuilding, both outside of Israel and also the new state of Israel. The museum very much reflected that. And so, for example, Abba Kovner, who was in many ways the educational leading light of the museum at that time, his museum was very much about also the story of Jewish victimization, of oppression. The central pillar in the building, the scrolls of fire, told that story of from the time of the destruction of the temple, through the Middle Ages, through the Crusades, through the Khmelnytsky pogrom in Ukraine and Poland, up and through the Holocaust, of the rise and fall of Jewish communities. The museum itself physically, yes, it had a kind of a darkness to it. And although Abba Kovner, at least on a personal level, I really regard him as one of my personal heroes, both a leader of the underground during the period of the Holocaust, a poet and writer, an educator, a leader of the kibbutz movement in Israel, and of course his work building the Diaspora Museum, what became Anu. A couple of decades after the opening of the museum, hey, things had changed. Israel had changed. The Jewish world had changed. People were different, technology was different, and there was a need to retell the Jewish story. And so the name Anu, we or us, a kind of museum of Jewish peoplehood, seemed much more appropriate in many ways. And I know that both visiting the museum myself and when we visit with the groups of J-Squared Adventures, synagogues and federations, family groups, bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, kids, young people who are celebrating that special time in their lives with their families, people are really taken by it. They really get a lot out of it. They really enjoy it. Because again, I think there is something which is surprising, even refreshing about the museum, which suggests to people, hey, dealing with things Jewish can be done differently.
Yeah, so true, because I actually visited Bet HaTfusot as a child. So, dating myself, I was about 10 years old in the late 1980s. And I remember going as a kid and just finding what you described as museums as stuffy, dark. That was my impression of Bet HaTfusot. And I do remember, as a 10-year-old, it was my first time in Israel. So I do remember visiting many places in Israel and feeling that sense of aliveness, whether it came through, you know, the palm trees or whatever it was, the kotel, whatever it was I connected to. I cannot say that Bet HaTfusot made the cut in what captivated me, whether it's because of museum. So when I went to Anu myself personally for the first time, first of all, before I entered into the doors, I love the concept, right? Even just the words Anu, like the Jewish people. Like there's something very enticing, inviting, welcoming about the idea of we. I'm like, okay, so you walk in the door and exactly as you say, Scott, like there's this feeling of peoplehood and aliveness. And I very much felt that as opposed to it being like a museum where you're digging up the past and you feel that past doesn't necessarily have a connection with who you are, this museum, as well as drawing on our past and everything that we have to be so proud of, also brings you very much to the present with Jews' contemporary contributions and also just many surprises and fun, quirky niches within the museum that just brings that element of surprise and pride and all the feelings.
Yeah, for sure. I think the other piece here is who is it for? Because even though obviously when we're bringing our groups, we're typically with Jews who are coming from outside of Israel, but the museum is also meant for Israelis.
Correct.
And so, for example, it's open on Shabbat.
Right.
You know, out of just the basic cultural recognition. Hey, that's the day that most people are with their family. That's the day where people who are not necessarily religious have a chance to travel and to be at a place like Anu. And particularly on a nice rainy day in the wintertime, it's a great place to be able to come and to do something which is both meaningful and enjoyable and get a little bit of a sense of what's our connection with this place. A lot of times in Israel, there was a kind of a prejudice that, hey, we're a different people. We're a different branch of the tree. And I think one of the things Anna was reminding us is that the story of Israel is not just about the state of Israel, but it's about the people of Israel, Am Yisrael, wherever we lived, in whatever period of time, the attempt to build community, the attempt to be creative, the attempt to give meaning to our lives through not just, but also our Jewish lenses and through a sense of trying to build something that we can call our own.
And listeners in North America, when they come to Israel and visit Anu, they also can have a sense that amongst them are also who are like, you know, checking out the different floors and the different exhibits. Amongst them are Israelis who are just as much learning about their contribution from abroad, what the diaspora has brought, in as much as they're coming to learn. There's that reciprocal kind of relationship where it fosters this atmosphere of learning from each other.
Yeah, Sorel, I think that's really, really true. And that idea of learning from each other, I think Anu, interestingly, is in a hidden way bit countercultural. You know, for example, if here in Israel there was a sense that we're the center of the Jewish world, everything else kind of revolves around us. In Anu, in the museum, in the exhibits, there's a sense that, yes, for sure, look, the state of Israel, it's an amazing, miraculous creation. It's a game changer in every way with regards to Jewish life in modern times. But there are other communities out there.
Two things can be true.
Two things can be true. And to hold those two things together is, I think, part of the countercultural aspect of Anu. We know that in Israeli schools, even up until today, the amount of time that's devoted to learning about Jewish communities, living Jewish communities. I'm not talking about pre-Holocaust.
Right.
Living Jewish communities
Interesting.
outside of Israel is really very, very little. And so one of the ways to bring Israeli children, families, even soldiers who are coming to Anu to do educational tours within the framework of their army service based on a basic idea that, hey, if we're better citizens, more knowledgeable, we'll also be better soldiers. Anu is part of that countercultural move to expand the Jewish story in a very gentle, non-obtrusive kind of way.
A bit of humility wouldn't do us any harm anyway.
Yeah, that's for sure. That never hurts. That never hurts.
And the fact of the matter is, in terms of what you're saying, you know, Israel's a game changer, and it is. But the reality is that less than half of the world's Jews live in Israel, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. Look, the bottom line is that probably as time goes on, just because Israel is the only place in the world where a Jewish community is growing because of natural reproduction, Israel will be the largest Jewish community in the world, and it may be today, depending on which demographers you look at. But the number of Jews is not necessarily the question of quality of Jewish life. And so, again, the same way that we can learn from other places and other communities in all kinds of fields that we're involved with, obviously we can also look within our own house and take a look at the way that Jews live in communities all around the world, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in England, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in South America, and to bring some of those things to Israel and vice versa, the great things which are happening in Israel, whether it's in the field of Jewish studies academically, whether it's around Jewish messages and even Hebrew language in modern music, that these things can also be taken and shared with our brothers and sisters who do not live here in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or Kiryat Shmona.
And it's a model that celebrates diversity, and especially in any kind of time where there is polarization, and even though in some sense it feels that the world is shrinking and that everything's getting closer to each other, there are still divides. To have under one roof 3 floors, visual representation of the Jewish people on each floor is extremely powerful.
Definitely. There's an article that was written already way back in 2012, so it was during the period when the museum was being reworked, redone, reimagined, and it talked about this idea of the museum and at its base, a vision of radical inclusivity. It was an article that appeared in Tablet magazine, and the author is Isabella Tabarovsky, and she talks about this idea of, hey, here it's a place where the borders are being stretched. Here it's a place where almost anything goes. If someone identifies being Jewish in way A or way B or way C, as long as they identify. And I think that's also an interesting, even countercultural kind of a message, particularly within the context of Israeli society, but also it's true of other Jewish communities. We sometimes have a desire to, create the border, define the box, and anyone who's outside of the border or outside of the box, they're not exactly part of us. And this idea that Tabarovsky raises of radical inclusivity, I really find that very refreshing in the museum. So one of the things that I like to do when I'm there is to bring groups and actually start not with the past of the Jewish people's story, but to start with the present. When you go up to the 3rd floor, so there's a whole series of video screens. They're not quite 3D, but they're large enough. They're more than people-sized. And each screen, a different Jewish voice is telling their story. So it could be an Israeli from Ethiopian background who talks about the struggle of the Ethiopian Jewish community to get to Israel and to find their place in Israel.
I love that section.
It's amazing. And it could be a lesbian rabbi from somewhere in the United States talking about my journey as a lesbian, as a Jew, struggling to see myself not just as part of the community, but to take on leadership roles. Why? Because I see myself as an integral part of the ongoing living story of the Jewish people. Or it could be an Israeli Orthodox family living in Jerusalem talking about, hey, for us, coming in for Shabbat, going out to buy the flowers, getting the Friday newspaper, going to synagogue together, celebrating Kiddush around our family table, and each person with their story, bring in all the different strands and the kind of hall of panels, giving legitimacy to each of these stories. And hey, it's okay to stand in front of a panel and to nod your head in agreement. And it's also okay to stand in front of a particular panel, hear the story, and a bit say, wait a second, I'm not sure, kind of how I want to digest this.
But I think at the end of your comfort zone is where growth begins.
Exactly.
Because if it doesn't challenge you, it doesn't change you. So if you have that potential to leave there with a different vision, a different perspective, take with you a different perspective, I already think that you've gained.
Yeah, 100%.
From that alone.
100%. In the same way that we would want that kind of an education in general studies. Think about what a terrible doctor you would be if you only did medical studies and it never took you outside of your comfort zone.
100%.
Or what a terrible architect or what a terrible lawyer you would be. Things Jewish also need to stretch us, challenge us, a little bit knock us off of our heels, out of our comfort zone.
Pedestal.
Yeah,
that we
exactly.
may put ourselves on.
Exactly. And I think that Anu was trying to play that game with people within the very comfortable air-conditioned confines of the museum, hoping that when people leave the museum, they'll take some of these questions and maybe in the car ride on the way home, you know what? people continue to talk about it.
This conversation, it just keeps taking me back to that visit as a child, because I think of it as darkness. And now I think of Anu as color, as really like a celebration of diversity in its different like shades. You were talking about those videos. I love the third floor, especially my favorite section is Jewish humor, right? Because that section just showcases how humor has connected Jews across the globe. And, you know, goodness knows we're talking about Jewish history and we don't necessarily think of it as something to laugh at, right? But I think that that is a testimony to our resilience. And if we think about how humor's connected Jews across the globe, from Mel Brooks, Jerry Seinfeld, to the shtetls of Eastern Europe, I mean, think about it. How many comedians do you know and that you love who are Jewish? And how much of that humor resonates with you because it feels like you're home, because there's a sense of familiarity wrapped inside those jokes, something you've always known. And I think that, you know, when we think about Jews' contribution to humanity, I think that a big part of humor is self-deprecation, right? And that ability to laugh at ourselves, that blend of self-deprecation, wit, and heart has allowed us as a Jewish people to not only survive, but thrive in every corner of the world. Whether you're laughing at a Jewish wedding or you're watching Curb Your Enthusiasm, it's a humor that ties us together.
When you talk about that issue of celebrating, the panel that kind of reflects to me that idea of celebration more than ever is that last visual in the museum, the animated film that Shannon Street from the Israeli hip-hop band the Dag Nachash was central in creating. And it's the whole like kind of parade of Jewish history in this, you know, hip-hop, very kind of funny, cartoonish way. And you see, you know, everyone from Theodore Herzl to Einstein to Bader Ginsburg to, I mean, you name it, you know, dancing through the streets, you know, singing this celebration of the Jewish experience. You know, on the one hand, part of me is like, I look at that, it's like, okay, it's a little bit corny. It's a little bit maybe over the top. But, you know, I can also understand where there's a strong desire among many to find those moments where Judaism isn't a yoke that has to be carried on our shoulders, but is something that can fly with wings, on the wings, in this case, of laughter. And again, so the museum, it plays with that. And I think it's a question of kind of testing borders. So, you know, obviously, again, in the museum, you have the references to really, really amazing Jewish creative minds who not just changed Judaism, but had impact universally. You know, so whether it's Maimonides in the field of philosophy in the Middle Ages, or whether it's, of course, in modern times, Bob Dylan in the field of culture and music and poetry and literature. Mm-hmm. You know, and there are other things in the museum where you kind of scratch your head and say, does that really belong here? But I think those kinds of things that makes me ask myself, if I was building this museum, let's say I was doing a mini Anu in the place where I live, how would I tell the story of my own Jewish community? And I think, again, when we talk about visitors coming to see Anu, you know, I would really like people to take away some of those questions and reflect it back on their own home community. What's our story? How do we tell it? What do we share? What do we want both our children and grandchildren to know about us? But what do we also want our neighbors to know about us? And so Anu is in some ways, I think, also an invitation to not just be an observer on the exhibit.
I like that.
But to actually take on the Jewish experience and ask, how can I, in my own life, because probably most people are not going to go out and build their own museum, in my own life, in my own house, in the way that I behave in the community that I live in, how can I be a certain kind of representation of the Jewish experience? Is that a responsibility, a role that I want to play and I can define to not just be an observer, but to actually be a participant in this story?
And that it's not just history, that it's dynamic, that it's an ongoing story. And that feeling of dynamism also, I think, is like a really profound element of the Anu Museum.
Yeah, for sure. On that level, just like the technology had to be changed in the museum between the 1970s and the 21st century, just a little bit. And that'll obviously be one of the challenges the museum will have to deal with over the years. But on a more serious level, how do you keep updating the museum so that dynamism, those new Jewish stories, those new Jewish experiences, those new voices who are pushing borders and offering new modes of Jewish creativity, new contributions to the general society, how will they be brought into the museum? And obviously, they're not going to keep building new floor every 10 years. The donors would probably be pretty upset about that. But that means you're going to have to literally take out something
and replace
to
it.
Put something else in. And that's very interesting
act.
Exactly. That's a very interesting game that the people behind the museum are going to have to ask themselves. But that's the same challenge we play in our own lives as we're building families, building communities.
Changing our hats.
Exactly. What are the things we take with us? What are the things we leave behind? What are the things we take out of our suitcase? And what are the things that we choose to add to the suitcase? And maybe there's a time where we need a whole new suitcase. And that's a whole nother level, perhaps, of dynamism and creativity and innovation that each one of us has to contend with. And now, something for the road. A tip, a recommendation to help you make every journey your own. We're here with Dan Tadmor, CEO of Anu. Dan, welcome. First of all, I have to say I'm very, very excited, very, very happy that you found the time to join us. Obviously, if we're talking about Anu, there's really no better person than you. And so we really went to the top of the ladder. And so really, thanks for devoting the time and being with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
For sure. I mean, I think you know that the groups who travel with J Squared Adventures, most of them are visiting Anu. And I have to say, from the times, many, many times, that myself and the other tour educators are out in the field at Anu, people love it. They're so excited about the museum. They're so excited about the campus. They're so engaged with the idea of what it is. And so we wanted you to give us a bit of the behind the scenes.
So thank you. It's wonderful to hear that people are engaged, that they're having a good visitor experience. So a little bit about Anu. So the full name is Anu Museum of the Jewish People, and it is situated on the Tel Aviv University campus in the north of Tel Aviv. It is the largest and most comprehensive museum of its kind in the world. So there are hundreds of Jewish museums all over the world, and they're usually divided into two categories. They're either museums that tell the story of Jews of a certain area, city, state, country. So you go to the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam and you learn about Dutch Jews, and you go to the Fine Jewish Museum in Philadelphia and you learn about North American Jews. Or they are Holocaust museums. Our museum is the only one that attempts to tell the Jewish story in its entirety. So historically, geographically, and thematically, we're trying to cover the entire story. That explains why it is so big. It's 72,000 square feet, about 7,000 square meters. It's a lot. And it's also a very dense museum. It's not one of these places where you have a hall with one picture hung on the wall. It's a very dense museum. There's a lot going on. There's lots of media and interactive. And so technically, if you were to see and read everything, you need to spend a week in the museum.
Or at least.
Typically, people's attention is about 90 minutes. I mean, that's the average. And so when visiting the museum, first of all, it's a museum that you can visit again and again, but also whether it's an individual or a group that comes into the museum, we like to have a conversation with these people to make sure that we make the best use of their 90 minutes. And so depending on language, background, points of interest, we want to make sure that we give the visitors the best highlight tour that we can. We've also got some thematic tours on audio guides. So if you're coming in and you want to delve into whether it's territorial Jews of Morocco or Jews of Iraq or whatever, or thematic, you want to experience the museum through art or through music. So we've cut thematic verticals through the museum that enable people to personalize their experience.
On that level, it really is an entire ocean, whether it's using the audio guides or the very, very fine local guides that the museum so carefully trains, or whether it's our own excellent tour educators. There's really so many different ways to dive into that ocean. And I think that's one of the beauties of the place. Each person has a chance to take a little bit something different away. And so I have to ask you, you know the place so intimately, the revisioning and the redesign and all the nuts and bolts. When you think about travelers who are coming from mainly the United States, at least in terms of J Squared Adventures, what do you want them to take away? What are you hoping that they'll leave the museum and talk about as they're walking back to the bus?
So I would say the following. If they are Jewish, I would be very happy if they came away with an enhanced sense of belonging to the Jewish people. They will have discovered something about themselves or about the Jewish people that will inform their sense of belonging and bolster it. That would be for our Jewish visitors. We get a lot of non-Jewish visitors, and the museum is very relevant to these people as well. And so for those visitors, I would say, one, satisfy your sense of curiosity about who the Jews are, get the complete story of where we came from and various incarnations through time and geographically as well. So I would say enhance your knowledge of who Jews are. And I would also, for non-Jews, I would say the following. Until the year 586 BC, which is the destruction of the first temple, all Jews resided in the land of Israel. Since then, and it's helping with the math here, it's over 2,600 years, Jews never reside in one place. The phenomenon of Jewish diaspora has been with us for over 2,600 years. And that means that Jews have dispersed all over the world and have intertwined or interacted with almost every civilization. And so whoever you are, you can also take an interest in the way that Jews have interacted with the civilization that you live in now or that your ancestors came from. So that's another aspect or another takeaway that I would ideally like people to talk about when they get back on the bus.
No, I think that's an exciting invitation because I'm thinking about groups who are traveling with J Squared Adventures, not just to Israel, but they're in Prague and they're in Berlin and they're in Budapest, they're in Argentina, they're all over the world. And many of these places are places which, of course, represented and their stories are shared within the walls of the museum. And so it gives people a chance to reflect off of places they've been or places they're going to, as you say, to get that larger story. Obviously, two of us are Israelis, and for us, this is very much the center of our world. But for us also, and hopefully for Israelis who are visiting the museum, that sense of our story is more than this important but small piece of geography. I think that's another aspect of the museum that's very, very important.
Absolutely. I think you touched on a point. Many Israelis are not fully informed about Jewish life and history outside of Israel. So that's another important aspect of the work that we do.
For sure. Because I think it's interesting. So many of us who are involved in public service for the Jewish world, in education, etc., we live and breathe it. And there are those moments where we're very into and very tied up with the nuts and bolts of an immediate answer that needs to be given around a crucial issue. But we also have time to reflect on, hey, where have I been? What am I doing? What have I learned? If you think about the museum, picture yourself, I'm sure it happens not that often because you are very busy, a morning walkthrough. Everyone is gone in the evening at the end of the day. Are there certain corners of the museum that you, Dan, go to find inspiration? Because I think that kind of an insight would be an invitation for our people to also visit those corners. And maybe it's things that they haven't had a chance to see before.
So I've been to the museum for 12 years, which means that I've had the privilege of being part of its reimagining. In the same building, there was a museum that operated from 1978. And with time, it grew old and irrelevant. And so about 15 years ago, we embarked on a very long process of reimagining the museum. It takes a while to raise the money that you need. It takes a while to plan what you want to do and actually execute. We opened the new museum in mid-2021. So I've been here for that entire process. And in that respect, they're all my children. So I think,
how can you choose a favorite?
But I will nonetheless answer your question.
Good, thanks.
In the following way, everything changed exactly a year ago. And whatever was my favorite object or spot in the museum changed exactly a year ago. with the acquisition and gifting to the Museum of Codex Sassoon. Codex Sassoon is the oldest and most complete copy of the Hebrew Bible as we know it. It was written 1,100 years ago in this area of Greater Israel. It then belonged to a Jewish community in Syria. That community ceased to exist with the Mongol invasion. That blows your mind. There were Mongols in this area, including in Israel. They got all the way to Gaza, raiding all the way to Gaza. So that community in Syria ceased to exist. And because it's a codex, it's a book, there's actually an inscription in the book saying, this now is in the hands of, I forget the name, and he takes it upon himself to return it to the community. That never happened. The community never reestablished itself. And so this book disappears for about 600 years. Nobody knows where it is, and reemerges in 1929. It's the whole story. But here we have the oldest, and the reason for the formulation oldest, most complete, is that there is one other codex called the Aleppo Codex that is as old as this one. Both are from the 10th century. But about 40% of the pages of the Aleppo Codex are missing, whereas Codex Sassoon is almost complete. Out of 800 pages, there are 12 that are missing. And so this exquisite object that has such significance for the Jewish people went on auction last year at Sotheby's. And one of our supporters, Ambassador Alfred H. Moses of Washington, D.C., bought it and gave it to us. It is the most expensive Jewish manuscript ever sold on an auction. It went ultimately for $38.1 million. I don't care about the money. I care about the object. And it's not as if we'll ever sell it, okay? But just to give people an idea of what is the going price for the oldest Bible in the world. And then it arrived in Israel on October 5th, a special El Al flight, a ceremony on the tarmac, and we were to inaugurate it here on October 9th. And that was never to be, because war broke out on October 7th. The Codex went straight to the vaults, to the 1.5-ton safe that we had acquired for it. And until projectiles stopped flying overhead, including today, the day that we're recording the session, we're not going to be taking it out on display. It survived 1,100 years. Nothing's going to happen to it on our watch. But there is a wonderful gallery that tells its story, and a wonderful true-to-life replica of the codex that we're displaying. So the story is told in the museum in a wonderful gallery. And hopefully, as hostilities cease, we will be able to finally display it. For me, this is the heart of the museum. It's the heart of the Jewish story. It symbolizes Jewish resilience through the ages. Think about this book, that what it has seen, right? It has seen empires come and go. It has seen, different parts of Jewish history. It resurfaced in 1929, which was the year of the Hebron massacre. It came to Israel 2 days before the October 7th atrocities. And so this is an object that just means a lot. And of course, because it is the Bible, it has significance to all three monotheistic religions. And it is as close to the source as you're going to get. So to me, this is now the beating heart of Anu.
Beautiful. It's a beautiful image. And really, I think when we think about Anu as an institution, so many of the exhibits are replicas of artifacts. It's very different than a regular museum. There's a very expansive, very beautiful collection of real artifacts, from Leonard Cohen's guitar to the Codex. And when you talk about the Codex, as you say, it really does encapsulate a kind of core message about connection, about longevity. You use the word resilience, a word that we've been using a lot this year. And we can certainly hope that when people come to Anu, they'll see it much more than an conventional museum, but they'll see it as a connection point, a place to plug into. And like it's very clear, the place has inspired you so much professionally and personally, our visitors will also find their inspiration to take home. So Dan, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm looking forward to talking again in the future.
Thank you for hosting me. This was a pleasure. And let's talk again soon.
Thanks for listening. Dive deeper into the world of travel on our J Squared Adventures website. That's j2adventures.com. And stay in the loop with our latest adventures on all our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, all under J2 Adventures. And if you enjoyed hanging out with us, don't forget to leave us a comment, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, travel safely and keep wondering. I'm Sorrel.
I'm Scott.
See you soon with the Wandering Jews.